The Quorell Collective did not make mistakes. This was a fundamental principle of their civilization, encoded into their bureaucratic structures with the same rigid certainty that governed their exoskeletons. When they did make mistakes, which, despite their protestations, happened with the regularity of any species that had developed interstellar travel and the paperwork to accompany it, they made them with such spectacular thoroughness that the mistakes themselves became systemic achievements. Maren Castel had been hired by the Quorell precisely because she was human, and humans had a reputation for thriving in what the collective called high-chaos organic environments. This was their clinical way of describing any planet where things grew without asking permission first. Maren's job was agricultural consultation, which mostly meant being sent to worlds the Quorell found bewildering, and writing reports about whether crops could be grown there without everything immediately dying or mutating into something that screamed. Verdak 7 was classified as a Class-V Deathworld in Quorell taxonomy. This designation covered everything from mildly inconvenient weather patterns to the atmosphere is literally on fire, so Maren had learned to take their dramatic categories with several grains of salt. The planet had a breathable atmosphere, liquid water, and a jungle so dense that orbital scans couldn't penetrate more than 3 meters below the canopy. The Quorell wanted to know if it was colonizable. Maren was there to spend 3 days poking around, taking samples, and filing the appropriate forms. The landing shuttle deposited her in a clearing that had been burned open by their landing thrusters, along with 4 sealed containers of equipment and supplies rated for a week-long survey. The Quorell pilot, whose name Maren had never successfully pronounced, chittered something that the translator rendered as standard extraction, 72 hours, maintain beacon signal integrity. Maren confirmed receipt of this information, watched the shuttle lift off with the kind of precise vertical ascent that only species without any sense of showmanship could achieve, and turned to survey her temporary home. The jungle began exactly where the scorched earth ended, as if respecting a property line. Trees rose into the canopy like cathedral columns, their trunks wider than Maren was tall, covered in bark that seemed to shift colors in the dappled light. Vines connected everything to everything else in a 3-dimensional web that made the whole place feel less like a forest and more like the inside of a very ambitious terrarium. The air was humid enough to drink and smelled like rain, earth, and something slightly sweet that Maren couldn't identify. Sounds came from every direction, clicks, whistles, rustles, and a low thrumming that might have been insects or might have been the planet itself humming along to some rhythm she hadn't learned yet. Maren checked her scanner, confirmed the air was non-toxic, and got to work. Setting up base camp was routine enough that she could do it while mentally composing her grocery list for when she got back to the Quorell station. Thermal tent deployed in the center of the clearing, motion sensors arranged in a perimeter, portable lab bench assembled, water filtration system connected to the collapsible containers, emergency beacon activated on the standard frequency. She spent the rest of the first day doing what she'd been hired to do, walking careful transects into the jungle, scanning plants, collecting soil samples, and making detailed notes about everything from ground composition to canopy density. The jungle was loud, not dangerously loud, just constantly alive with noise in a way that made silence seem like an extinct concept. Maren found herself narrating her observations out loud, just to contribute to the general din. Root system extensive, possibly communal, she told a cluster of ferns that came up to her waist. Bark pattern suggests rapid growth phase, need to check ring samples. The ferns did not respond, but something in the canopy above her did, producing a sound like wooden wind chimes being enthusiastically shaken. By evening she'd catalogued 43 distinct plant species, identified 3 potential water sources, and learned that the local equivalent of mosquitoes were about twice as large as Earth's version, but thankfully seemed uninterested in human blood. She ate a ration pack labeled Nutritional Protein Blend Chicken Style, which tasted like someone had described chicken to an algorithm that had never experienced taste, and made her first attempt to contact the extraction shuttle. No response. This wasn't unusual. The canopy was thick, and communication could be spotty. She made a note in her log, set her beacon to active pulse mode, and went to sleep listening to the jungle's nighttime symphony of sounds that were probably not predators, but definitely weren't not predators either. Day 2 followed the same pattern. Survey, sample, document, attempt contact. The scanner revealed that several of the plants she'd collected had edible components, though edible in this case meant won't immediately kill you rather than would taste good in a salad. Maren marked their locations on her map and continued expanding her survey radius. She found the stream she'd detected from orbit, a clear flow of water about 2 meters wide that moved with the kind of cheerful burbling that suggested it had no idea it was on a Class-V Deathworld. Still no response from the shuttle. Maren's mild concern was beginning to develop into actual concern, the way a headache develops into something that makes you check the medicine cabinet. She cycled through every communication frequency her equipment could access. Nothing. The emergency beacon showed active transmission, which meant either the Quorell were receiving it and choosing not to respond, unlikely, or something was interfering with the signal, more likely, or they'd input the wrong coordinates into their retrieval system and were currently looking for her on the wrong side of the planet. Unfortunately, most likely, given their track record. On day 3, Maren stopped thinking of herself as on assignment and started thinking of herself as camping indefinitely. This mental shift was less dramatic than it might sound. She'd grown up on agricultural colonies where indefinitely was just how long everything took. Crops grew when they grew. Animals bred on their schedule, not yours. You learned patience not as a virtue, but as a practical necessity. She spent the day observing instead of just cataloguing. The jungle, she realized, operated on patterns. A particular species of bird, 6-winged, iridescent, loud, appeared every morning at what her chronometer said was 0847 local time, and spent exactly 30 minutes doing something that looked like a cross between feeding and arguing with its neighbors. A type of vine she'd initially dismissed as decorative closed its leaves when anything larger than a small rodent approached, then reopened after the threat passed. The stream's water level rose every afternoon and fell by evening, despite no apparent tidal influence, which suggested underground aquifer systems responding to temperature changes, or possibly something even more interesting that she didn't have the equipment to investigate properly. She made notes. Lots of notes. If she was going to be here longer than 3 days, she might as well produce a survey report comprehensive enough to justify the collective's eventual embarrassment when they realized they'd forgotten her. The plant testing took 3 days minimum, according to every safety protocol Maren had ever been taught. She selected 5 specimens that her scanner rated as potentially edible and began the process. Scan for toxins, apply to skin for allergic reaction, hold in mouth for irritation response, consume small amount, and monitor. It was tedious, but so was dying from eating something that looked like a sweet potato but turned out to be full of alkaloids that made your liver shut down. By day 7, Maren had moved her camp. The initial landing site was too exposed, too vulnerable to the weather patterns she was beginning to understand. The stream valley offered better protection, elevated enough to avoid flooding, but low enough to access water easily, with rock formations that blocked the prevailing wind and provided natural anchoring points. She disassembled her thermal tent and rebuilt it against a cliff face, then spent 2 days constructing a more permanent shelter using materials that wouldn't run out of battery charge. The local trees had branches that, once cut, could be lashed together with vine fibers that dried into something nearly as strong as rope. The leaves from what she'd started calling umbrella trees, because taxonomy was for people who had laboratories, and she had a jungle, layered into waterproof thatch when arranged correctly. She built the frame first, testing each joint, then added the walls and roof in sections. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional and significantly larger than her tent. The old camp became storage for equipment she didn't need daily. Maren established a routine because humans needed routines the way plants needed sunlight. Wake at dawn when the 6-winged birds started their daily argument. Check the simple snares she'd built, not to catch anything yet, just to understand what moved through the area and when. Gather water, boil it even though the filtration system worked fine, because redundancy kept you alive. Survey a new section of jungle, expanding her map in careful increments. Return by afternoon before the something large in the canopy began its daily patrol. Process findings, maintain equipment, prepare food, sleep when the jungle shifted into its nighttime configuration of sounds. The first local plant she ate was the root vegetable that looked like a turnip crossed with a coconut. She roasted it over her fire, watched it carefully for any signs of toxicity, and took a cautious bite. It tasted like a turnip crossed with a coconut, which was significantly better than anything that had come out of a ration pack. She ate half and saved half for observation, but when nothing terrible happened over the next 12 hours, she went back to the plant's location and harvested more. By week 2, her ration packs had become supplements rather than primary food sources. She'd identified grain-like seeds from a riverside plant that ground into a coarse flour. A purple leafy thing that grew in shaded areas and tasted vaguely like spinach, if spinach had decided to be more interesting. And she'd successfully trapped, processed, and cooked something that looked like a rabbit had been designed by a committee that also had strong opinions about armor plating. The cooking became a challenge, in the same way crossword puzzles were a challenge, something to focus on that had clear goals and immediate feedback. Her camp stove's fuel was precious, so she learned to build fires using wood from specific trees that burned clean without producing the toxic smoke other varieties created. She constructed drying racks from branches and dried strips of meat in the sun. She ground seeds between flat rocks, mixed them with water, and made flatbreads that were dense enough to be used as construction materials but, when fresh, were actually edible. The real breakthrough came when she found the hot springs. They were tucked into a rocky area upstream where geothermal activity heated water that bubbled up from underground. The water was too hot to touch directly, but had deposited minerals along the edges, including, Maren confirmed with her scanner and then with her tongue, salt, actual salt. She scraped it into one of her containers like she'd discovered gold, because in terms of making food not taste like disappointment, she basically had. That night, she made stew. The root vegetables, some of the grain seeds, chunks of the armored rabbit creature, the purple leaves, all in water flavored with salt, and a bitter herb she'd found that functioned like pepper, if pepper had decided to be more aggressive about it. She ate it slowly, made notes about ratios and cooking times, and gave it a solid 7 out of 10 rating with clear paths to improvement. "You know," she said to the jungle at large, "if you lot had a restaurant, you'd make decent money. Terrible ambiance though. Really need to work on the bug situation. The jungle responded with the sound of something large moving through the canopy about 100 meters away. Maren added another log to her fire and finished her stew. By week 3, she'd stopped thinking about the shelter as temporary and started thinking about it as home, in the same way you might think of a hotel room as home if you'd been there long enough to learn which drawer stuck and which water pipe made concerning noises at night. She'd expanded the structure with a storage annex where she kept dried foods organized by type and harvest date. She dug a cold storage pit into the shaded soil near a rock face, lined it with stream stones, and found it kept things fresh for days. Her map of the jungle now covered a 3-hour circuit that passed through multiple biomes: dense canopy forest, riverside clearings, rocky highlands, and an area she called the Fern Valley, where plants grew in layers like a very enthusiastic layer cake. She knew where to find the root vegetables, where the grain plants grew thickest, where the armored rabbits had their burrows, and which trees produced a sap that worked as adhesive. She'd also identified the territories. The something large in the canopy hunted in a specific area during late afternoon. She never saw it directly, only evidence: broken branches high up, claw marks on tree trunks, and once memorably, a pile of what was definitely scat from something that ate primarily meat. Maren adjusted her schedule accordingly. She didn't need to see the apex predator, didn't need to fight it or prove anything. She just needed to not be in its hunting grounds when it was hungry. There were smaller territorial animals too. A pack of 6-legged creatures about the size of dogs that marked trees with scent glands and absolutely did not want her anywhere near their den. She gave them space. Something that looked like a cross between an owl and a catastrophe that nested in the rocky highlands and made horrible screaming noises at dawn. She avoided that area during breeding season, which appeared to be now. The jungle wasn't hostile, Maren realized. It was just busy with its own concerns, and if you paid attention to those concerns, you could exist alongside them without everything becoming a territorial dispute. Like living in a city where you learned which streets were safe after dark and which subway cars to avoid during rush hour. She documented everything. Behavioral patterns, seasonal changes. Certain plants were flowering now that hadn't been before, suggesting she'd arrived at a specific point in the local climate cycle. Territorial boundaries, food sources, water quality fluctuations. Her log had become less a survey report and more an ethnography of jungle life, written by someone who'd become one of its residents. The Quorell would never understand this, she thought, while watching a sunset turn the canopy into stained glass. They'd see her shelter, her food systems, her careful maps, and they'd classify it all as survival behavior, emergency protocols, desperation measures. They wouldn't recognize that she'd simply done what humans had always done in new places: watched, learned, adapted, and made dinner with whatever ingredients were available. A month in, Maren had achieved something she couldn't quite articulate, but felt in the way her body moved through the jungle. She wasn't fighting it anymore, wasn't treating every plant as a potential threat and every sound as a warning. She'd become part of the ecosystem's routine, a creature that occupied a territory, gathered resources without depleting them, and adjusted her behavior to accommodate her neighbors, even when those neighbors were 3 meters long and hunted from the treetops. Her diet had expanded to include 7 different plant sources, 3 protein sources, and various herbs that made everything taste less like survival and more like actual cuisine. She was eating better than she had in the Quorell Station cafeteria, where everything was optimized for efficient nutrition delivery rather than flavor. The burn she'd gotten from her camp stove 2 weeks ago had healed remarkably fast after she'd applied a poultice made from a leaf she'd tested, bright green, slightly sticky, growing in shaded areas near the stream. She documented the healing properties carefully, wondering if the Quorell's pharmaceutical division might be interested. She'd even stopped trying to eliminate the small flying insects that congregated around her shelter in the evenings. They were annoying, producing a high-pitched whine that made concentration difficult, but she'd noticed that when they were around, the larger biting insects stayed away. Some kind of territorial dispute, or possibly pheromone interference. Whatever the mechanism, the result was that tolerating minor annoyance prevented major irritation. She let them be. Twice a day, morning and evening, she attempted to contact the Quorell. She did this with the same routine commitment as brushing her teeth, necessary maintenance, but no longer fraught with hope or anxiety. Either they'd answer, or they wouldn't. Either they were looking for her, or they weren't. Either their bureaucracy would eventually notice the discrepancy, or she'd be filing reports about Verdak 7 from Verdak 7 for the foreseeable future. The situation was suboptimal, but so was most of life. You worked with what you had. Week 6 brought a realization that arrived while Maren was preparing dinner. She'd become quite elaborate with her meals now that she had reliable food sources and the time to experiment. Tonight's dish involved the root vegetables cut into cubes and roasted until caramelized, the grain seeds cooked into a kind of porridge, chunks of smoked meat from the armored rabbit, the purple leaves sautéed with salt and the pepper herb, and a sauce made from reduced stream water, more salt, and a tart berry she'd found that added acidity. She plated it, if you could call arranging food on a flat rock plating, and sat down to eat. The first bite was good. Actually good, not survival rations good, or making the best of things good. It was well balanced, properly seasoned, and demonstrated understanding of cooking technique. She'd made this with the same care she'd apply in a kitchen on any colony, just with different ingredients. This wasn't survival, Maren realized. This was just life. She'd spent her career moving between colonies and stations, each with different local food cultures, different ingredients, different ways of doing things. You arrived, you found the local markets, you learned what was in season, you figured out which neighborhoods were worth exploring and which required caution. You established your routines, built your networks, and made yourself at home in the space available. The jungle was the same. It had its seasons, its neighborhoods, its resources and risks. She'd learned to read it the way she'd learned to read every new place she'd lived. The only difference was that here, the neighbors were non-verbal and occasionally wanted to eat her, but honestly, she'd worked with Quorell bureaucrats who communicated less clearly and were just as territorial. Humans didn't conquer environments, she thought while savoring a particularly good bite of caramelized root vegetable. They didn't dominate or terraform or impose their will through superior technology. Or rather, they could do those things, but it wasn't what they did naturally. What humans did naturally was immigrate. They showed up, looked around, asked questions, even if those questions were being asked to plants and weather patterns, learned the local customs, and figured out how to make a life with whatever was available. She was probably gaining weight, Maren realized. Regular meals, good nutrition, plenty of physical activity, but not the constant stress of actual survival. She was sleeping well, her survey data was comprehensive, and she was genuinely curious about what tomorrow's exploration might reveal. The northern section of her mapped area had some interesting geological formations she hadn't investigated yet, and she'd spotted what might be fruit trees that deserved closer examination. If the Quorell showed up tomorrow, she'd have a solid report. If they showed up next month, she'd have an excellent report. If they never showed up, well, there were worse places to establish residency than a jungle with good water, abundant food, and neighbors who mostly left you alone if you respected their territories. She finished her dinner, cleaned her dishes in the stream, banked her fire, and went to sleep. Week 8 began like any other, until it didn't. Maren was processing the morning's harvest, several root vegetables, a collection of grain seeds, some of the purple leaves, when her scanner picked up something it hadn't detected in 2 months. A ship in orbit. She looked up at the canopy as if she could see through it to the sky beyond, then checked her scanner again. Definitely a ship. Definitely descending. Definitely heading for her location, which meant her beacon had finally done its job, or the Quorell had finally gotten around to checking their coordinates, or someone had noticed that their agricultural consultant had missed approximately 7 filing deadlines. 30 minutes later, a Quorell shuttle burned through the canopy and landed in the clearing she'd initially used, now significantly overgrown. The landing ramp deployed with mechanical precision, and a team of 6 Quorell descended, their exoskeletons gleaming in the dappled sunlight. The leader, whose translator identified him as Survey Director Trelk, approached her shelter with visible caution. Medical scanners were active. She could see the indicator lights blinking on their equipment. They were scanning for injuries, toxins, parasites, psychological trauma. All the things you'd expect to find in someone who'd been abandoned on a Class-V Deathworld for 2 months. Maren walked out to meet them, carrying a pot of stew because she'd been in the middle of cooking lunch. "Director Trelk," she said, using the formal greeting structure the Quorell preferred. "I'm glad you found me." The coordinates must have gotten scrambled in the initial drop-off. Trelk's antenna twitched in what Maren had learned to recognize as confusion bordering on distress. "Consultant Castel, you are ambulatory." "Yes? You appear healthy." "I am healthy. This is unexpected." Trelk's team spread out, scanning the area. One approached her shelter, scanner extended like a weapon, or possibly a shield. "Our calculations suggested resource depletion within 14 standard days. The planet's danger classification indicated high probability of predation, toxic exposure, or environmental casualties." Maren looked at her shelter, the sturdy structure she'd built, the food drying racks, the cold storage pit, the carefully tended fire, the organized supplies. She looked at the jungle beyond, with its patterns and rhythms she'd learned to read. She looked back at Trelk. "Would you like some stew?" she asked. "I'm curious if Quorell biochemistry can process the local flora. It would make excellent addition to my report." Trelk's translator produced a sound that it rendered as, which Maren took as a no. The extraction process was efficient in the way Quorell processes always were. They catalogued her equipment, documented her shelter, collected her data logs, and performed medical scans that came back with results that clearly troubled them because her health markers were better than when she'd arrived. Maren packed her personal items, left her shelter standing as a courtesy to the local ecosystem. It would decompose naturally within a few months, and boarded the shuttle. During the flight back to the collective station, she sat in the passenger bay and drafted her formal report. Verdak 7, she wrote, was entirely suitable for colonization, provided colonists approached it with appropriate methodology. The key was understanding the ecosystem's patterns and working within them, rather than attempting immediate terraforming or environmental dominance. The planet operated on observable cycles that could be learned through patient observation. Resource availability was high for anyone willing to invest time in identification and processing. Threat levels were manageable through territorial awareness and schedule adjustment. She included detailed appendices, edible plant species, water sources, seasonal patterns, animal behaviors, optimal shelter locations, and a collection of recipes that she noted were pending peer review but empirically successful. Director Trelk reviewed the report in real time, his antennae producing a series of movements that the translator struggled to interpret. "Consultant Castel," he said finally, "your recommendations suggest cohabitation with the existing ecosystem rather than environmental modification." "Yes. Our protocols do not include procedures for cohabitation. We engineer optimal conditions for Quorell physiology and behavioral requirements." "I know," Maren said. "That's why you hired me." There was a long pause. This fundamental approach difference may explain classification discrepancies between our species regarding planetary habitability. "That's probably part of it," Maren agreed. "You call them death worlds. We call them learning curves." The rest of the flight passed in silence, which was fine with Maren. She was tired, and while the shuttle's seats were ergonomically designed for Quorell anatomy rather than human, she'd slept in worse places. Like on the ground under a tarp during her first week in the jungle, before she'd learned which plants made good bedding material. When they reached the station, she was immediately shuttled through medical evaluation, psychological assessment, and a debriefing session that lasted 4 hours and seemed primarily focused on understanding how she hadn't died. She answered their questions patiently, provided her documentation, and suggested that their danger classification system might benefit from distinguishing between genuinely hazardous and requires adaptation. That evening, alone in her assigned quarters, Maren ate a meal from the station's synthesizer. It was nutritionally complete, properly proportioned, and tasted like someone had explained food to a machine and then asked it to extrapolate. She missed the jungle's ingredients, missed the process of cooking with real plants and actual fire, missed the satisfaction of making something good with her own hands from resources she'd gathered herself. She pulled up her personal log and added a final entry. Verdak 7 survey complete. Recommend reclassification from Class-V Deathworld to Class-II adaptation environment. Also recommend I be assigned to the next impossible planetary survey. Turns out, I'm good at these. The Quorell Collective would review her report, possibly for years, debating the implications of her methodology and whether it represented a replicable approach or a human-specific anomaly. They would write papers about adaptive survival strategies and conduct risk analyses about colonization approaches. They would do what they always did, process everything through their bureaucratic systems until it was properly categorized, filed, and forgotten. Maren didn't particularly care about any of that. She'd spent 2 months on a planet the Quorell considered deadly, and she'd treated it like an extended camping trip with particularly fresh ingredients. She'd built shelter, cooked meals, learned the neighborhood, and made herself at home. The jungle hadn't been hostile, it had just been new, and new was something humans had always been good at handling. She finished her synthesized meal, made a note to request assignment to whatever planet the Quorell found most terrifying next, and went to sleep dreaming of salt deposits and root vegetables and the sound of 6-winged birds arguing at dawn over territory that didn't really belong to anyone, including the human who'd spent 2 months learning to share it.